pleasant evening to all from the People's Cathedral as we present another series of community conversations. This is an initiative of the church to address some of the pertinent issues that confront our members. We here at the Cathedral, we adopt a holistic approach to human development. So we care to the spiritual, the physical, and the emotional. So there are some issues of concern to us that we will discuss. And this evening, the Council of Ministry will continue to look at the impact of COVID-19. This evening, we will be looking at the impact of COVID-19 through the eyes of our elderly community, with special emphasis this evening on persons living with dementia and Alzheimer's. Before I turn over to our moderator, Lisa, let's just bow our hearts in a word of prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your mercy and your love and your grace. We thank you for sustaining our lives during this day. Father Lord, we commit this session into your hands, dear God. And we ask, dear God, that you would touch us spiritually, you would touch us physically. Dear God, we pray that all that is said and done this evening will bring honor and glory to you. We pray that this evening's discussion will be one to stimulate interest, dear God, to generate, dear God, discussion, dear God, and create an awareness, dear God, of some of these issues as it relates to COVID-19 and our elderly. So, Father Lord, we give you the honor, we give you the glory, we give you the praise. In Jesus' name, amen. So I introduce you now to our moderator, Dr. Lisa McLean Trotman.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Pastor Jeff. As Pastor Jeff said, tonight we're going to have a session that will be looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the elderly. And we recognize that the elderly population is not a homogeneous population. They're very diverse. We have some who are very independent, who can manage for themselves, but then you also have those vulnerable groups. And tonight we want to focus on one of those vulnerable groups, and those are the people who are living with dementia or with Alzheimer's. And this evening we have three ladies who can speak to this in a very competent capacity. We have first Miss Pamela Brereton, and she is president of the Barbados Alzheimer's Association. We also have Dr. Ermi Bell, who is a psychiatrist and also vice president of the Barbados Alzheimer's Association. And last but not least, we have our dear senior pastor, Reverend Joel Callender, who would also join us speaking in the capacity of a caretaker. So ladies, without any further ado, I want to start first with Miss Brereton, and maybe you can start by giving us some information about Alzheimer's, about dementia. What is it? The World Health Organization estimates about 55 million people worldwide is living with this condition. What is the situation like in Barbados? What is it? So maybe you can let's just start by sharing some light with our listening audience about dementia, about Alzheimer's.
Well, first of all, I would like to make a correction on something that persons are often asking me. And the question is often asked is, what is dementia? And I know that sometimes people will say dementia, then they say Alzheimer's in a bit of a confusing way. But dementia is really a term that describes the symptoms of a large group of different illnesses, with Alzheimer's being one of the main ones, or the main focus, I should say. All right. But in Barbados, as far as Alzheimer's is concerned, the numbers are growing. Back in 2014, we had an estimate of about 4,000 persons, slightly over 4,000 persons living with dementia. Now this is 2022, and we're living in an aging society. So can you imagine those numbers? They've got to be maybe over 5,000 people living on this island with dementia. Care is a difficult part of it as well, because I often get a lot of calls where people are looking for help. Most people do not want to put mom or dad in a nursing home unless it's critical. So that is one of the biggest issues that we have with persons living with dementia in Barbados. And again, I get so many calls every day, at least 5 calls a day I get for persons that are having difficulties. The care is the biggest problem, as I said before, because a lot of people do not have the skills to deal with it. And it's very hard on them. So most of the times I have to be spending well, I spend a lot of time explaining to them the do's and the don'ts and so on. And even though you do that, they call you back again and they say, well, it's still not working out the way it's supposed to be. And that's because they don't comprehend what they're supposed to be doing or how they should care for the person that they're looking after. So that is the way it stands with Barbados on the disease itself. But there are different types of dementia. We have to understand that. And this is where when you take someone to the doctor and ask him, questions, you need to understand what type of dementia that person has. Because there's vascular dementia, we've also have Lewy bodies, and there's a number of diseases that go down the line when it comes to persons who lose their memory as well. And memory loss does not necessarily always come from having dementia or Alzheimer's, if you want to call it that. It can come from a number of things. You can get knocked over in the head. You can have had a car accident, and that can also bring on Alzheimer's. So we have to think of those as well. So,
so can you elaborate? I know you said that there were different types of dementia. Can you elaborate on that and also maybe help our viewing audience to understand, are the signs any different?
Well, first of all, vascular dementia, that's a broad term, okay? And it's associated with circulation of the blood in the brain. And then there's Lewy bodies, which is caused by the degeneration and death of nerve cells in the brain. Those are all best explained to you by the doctor. Perhaps Dr. Bell will be able to explain this. I don't like to tread. I'm not a doctor, so I don't like to tread where I shouldn't be. I always leave that up to Dr. Bell and other doctors as well. So those are the two that I can talk about. I became involved because of my family. I've had about 4 or 5 relatives who had Alzheimer's, and I had to be there to support each and every one. But then you've also got younger persons who are coming down with the disease as well, which is called, that's younger onset, people below 65. I have been talking to people in their 30s and 40s in Barbados who have Alzheimer's. So we also have to consider that. And, we often say, let's look at age. But when you're looking at age and you're looking at Alzheimer's, it's not just the elderly. It's you have to put those people somewhere in the middle to say, well, look, how are we going to deal with this? What's the solution? There's no solution except that we need to train families. We need to get families to understand. We need to develop more care, not necessarily through the institutions, but even the home care. You asked me earlier about the faith-based institution, and I think they can do a lot to help. That is something I've been trying to get established for the longest time, because I think you need to get more support groups. And I believe the best place to get those support groups started is within the churches, because most of us in Barbados congregate in the church. And I think that will be the best place to start with, getting people to attend the support groups and so on.
Okay, so just one question, then I'll move on to Dr. Bell. You mentioned that one of the things would be about training families,
yes,
in care, but perhaps maybe starting before that, how do you help families to identify if a loved one is developing dementia? I'm still unclear, but what do you look for? Is it simple forgetfulness? I mean, what is there any quick tips you can probably give someone that they can decide, well, maybe I need to take my relative to be diagnosed? I'm not asking you how you diagnose, because I mean, as lay persons, that's not what we're supposed to do. But what should be some of those red flags that maybe that we should look for?
That's a good question. There are 10 warning signs. And a lot of times we see them and we ignore them, because you and I might say, oh, I don't know where I put my keys. Okay. But that could be a warning sign. Not necessarily it is, but it could be. But I'm going to give you all the warning signs right now. There's memory changes that will disrupt your life. Challenges in planning and solving problems. Difficulty completing tasks at home, work, or leisure. Confusion with time. Might go down Bridgetown and then get lost, cannot find your way back. Those are the different signs. trouble understanding visual spatial relationships, new problems with words and speaking or writing, misplacing things, and that's a big one, misplacing things and losing the ability to retrace your steps, decrease in poor judgment, withdrawals from work or social activities, changes in mood and personality. And, you know, someone might think church, I use the church as an example, Sunday is usually church service, but that person might get up on a Wednesday morning thinking it's Sunday and get dressed and start going to church. Or you might see someone coming into church that used to dress nicely, and suddenly that person is not dressing nicely anymore. The dress is backwards. The man is not tying his tie properly. He might have a red sock on and a white sock, or he might have a brown shoe and a red shoe, or a brown shoe and a black shoe. Those are the things you look for. Those are the signs that you look for. And a lot of times people don't do that because they're not aware. You know, I can pick a person out with Alzheimer's very quickly now. I'm so used to it. You see someone standing at the bus stop with a person, they're wearing their house dress. You know, those are the things that you notice first. And if you're close to your family, you will also observe things that they have been doing or things that they're not used to be doing. You know, they put the money away and they can't find it, then they start accusing you. Well, Gloria, or whatever the person might be, you took my money. Gloria didn't take the money. It's just that the person put it away and cannot remember where they put it. Those are the things to look for.
And if you do, I know I said that was the last one, but I just have a quick follow-up question. If you do notice such signs or such behaviors, what should you do?
Well, this is time to get the person to the doctor. Now, that might be a difficult task too. Sometimes you might have to ask the doctor to come to you, or sometimes you might have to play a game. This might be, someone might say you're lying to the person, but what do you do if you want to get that person? A gentleman called me recently and he was having the most difficult time getting his mother to go and see the doctor. I gave him the doctor's name and so on. And it took a week before he could get her to the doctor. So I suggested him, well, just tell mom that you would like her to come with you because you are not feeling well and you really need her support. And that worked. For some reason or the other, it worked because when the person got there, it was easier for the doctor and, you know, to deal with the situation. Turned out that she has Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think this has been extremely informative. If you're now joining us, we're looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the elderly, focusing primarily on persons with dementia. And we have Pamela Brereton from the Barbados Alzheimer's Association, as well as Dr. Ermi Bell and our senior pastor, Reverend Joel Callender. Reverend Callender, I don't know, maybe I can bring you in here. How did you first know that your mom had Alzheimer's? Was it similar to what Ms. Brereton had discussed here?
Yes, Lisa, because we had Dr. Ramsey, who deals with Alzheimer's with dementia, in to do a session, I think 2018, 2019. And he had spoken to us about what to look for in terms of symptoms and behavior and so on. And at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, because they'd asked older people not to go out and so on, our mom was at home for quite a while. And it was during that time that we started to see some of that behavior coming out, like what Ms. Brereton spoke about just a few moments ago, like things like she would have the money and she would put it away and not remember, and then she would accuse the other people in the house of taking the money. She would not remember where she put things, even in terms of the household chores and so on. We saw that that was falling out, and she is a very meticulous person as it pertains to, you know, housekeeping and that type of thing. So when we saw those things happening, she doesn't live with me, she lives with the other relatives, and, you know, they did not understand. So they started to complain. But because I had been in that session and had that awareness, I picked up that, putting all together, that she probably, you know, was showing signs of dementia. And I remember that Dr. Ramsey had said there is a test that could be taken. And so I took her to have that test done. And, you know, like Ms. Brayton said, it was a little difficult trying to convince her to go because of the memory. But what had happened is that she had been ill the year before, and she was not happy with that physician. So I said to her, well, I know another physician who deals with older people, and let me take you to this physician and see what happens. And she acquiesced to that, and I took her, and we had the test done, and it showed that indeed her dementia was pretty advanced at that stage. And I must hasten to say that before the lockdown, Mom was very well. You know, she is still a very independent person. She was still, at that time, she would have been 83. She was still doing all her chores, going to the supermarket on her own, going to get her pension check changed, paying her bills, her utilities, and so on. She was doing all of that, and, you know, taking public transportation on her own wherever she wanted to go, and that type of thing. And it was only then, during the time of the lockdown, that we saw that there was a change in her. And, you know, that's when we took her. So it really was the awareness, and I thank God for that. That's why I am really appreciative of sessions like these and of the people who would come and speak to us. Because if I hadn't had that awareness, we would have thought, well, you know, she was just miserable and doing things. But having had that awareness, I was able then to take her quickly and have that testing done and be aware that this was the situation. And then, you know, get the information going forward as to how we should proceed.
Yeah. So thank you very much. So Dr. Bell, I want to bring you in here because the experience that Reverend Calendar just described, it reminded me of a friend of mine who also said his dad experienced similar issue during the lockdown. So my question is, did you see a lot of this? For example, you know, that whole idea of social isolation leading perhaps to early dementia among persons. I mean, maybe you can explain what social isolation, how that can impact on persons, perhaps leading to dementia. It is something that you would have seen during the early period of our COVID-19 experience here in Barbados. Dr. Bell, you're on mute.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for having me join this conversation on COVID-19 this evening. And of course, the impact of COVID-19 on the elderly, especially those persons who have Alzheimer's and other dementias, cannot be avoided when you come to talk about COVID-19. In actual fact, COVID-19 has been with us for the entire 2.5 years almost now. And when we initially started talking about COVID-19, we were talking about what is a virus, what virus is doing, how it's affecting other countries. When it came to Barbados, how it started to affect us. And there was a whole lot of stuff that we were learning and talking about and hoping that, of course, that the virus would just disappear. It didn't just disappear. And one of the things that came out very strongly when we started talking about COVID-19 is that there were vulnerable groups. And among the vulnerable groups were the elderly and those persons with NCDs, the non-communicable diseases, and other diseases that occur very often, mainly in the elderly. And of course, then there were those persons with dementias who had to be dealt with, especially those persons with Alzheimer's. And that is the important point that we are going to be looking at this evening, the fact that we had to deal with the elderly, and the elderly as well as those who have the incapacity of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Now, I don't want to go over everything that Ms. Burton says. That would not make a lot of sense for anybody. But Alzheimer's disease is not the disease of the elderly. And I say that because she mentioned that she had a number of people in her family who have had Alzheimer's disease. And we know now that Alzheimer's disease can occur in persons as early as in their mid-30s. Now we have also those who would be getting Alzheimer's and other dementia at the other end of the spectrum, like Pastor Calendar's mother, 83 years old. But all of these people were extremely vulnerable when COVID-19 hit. And I want to just also say that elderly is a very interesting word, because who are the elderly? We kind of categorize them from in the early to mid 60s and onward. And yet, of course, people like me we are older than that, I don't feel elderly. But we have to take into consideration that we have some of the vulnerabilities of the elderly, which were important in the pandemic of COVID-19. Just to focus a little bit on the fact that we have well elderly and ill elderly. And those two differentiations were mentioned earlier, and we had to consider both sets of people during COVID-19. And I'm going to jump a part of what I had in here, because I actually spelled out Alzheimer's warning signs, because I know it's something that people like to know and like to hear about. But because of the fact that Pamelia has already touched on those, Mr. Bertrand, I'll just go on to a further discussion. So we're going to look at the impact of those persons who were institutionalized. And I think most of us know that in North America, particularly, when COVID reached North America, many, many, many nursing homes were totally devastated. And persons died in high numbers because of COVID-19. And we would ask why. But the important thing is that the vulnerability of people who are in a nursing home, who cannot help themselves, who have to be looked after by other persons, was a very real situation. And so that was one thing that really came to light very, very seriously. The other thing you just mentioned a little while ago, the whole issue of isolation. And many people in nursing homes depend on that visit from a relative, however often, or from former friends who they used to hang with for whatever reason in early areas of their life. Or just earlier today, somebody was telling me that her mother is not able to communicate. She is in the stages of Alzheimer's, but when she holds your hand and you are there with her, she does not want to let go. And sometimes all that she would say is, if you say you're leaving, is so soon, but she does not really communicate on a major level other than that. So the reality of the situation is that we had persons who were suffering with Alzheimer's and who were in nursing homes. And these persons had to adhere to the protocols. Now, let's be realistic, they can do it. We had to make them do it. Some people had to be forced into doing things that they really weren't accustomed to doing. If you wash your hands twice a day, 3 times a day, because you're going to eat a meal or you were going to, go to the bathroom generally, that was okay. But now every time you touch something, you went to the door, you touched the doorknob, you were now expected to sanitize and clean yourself. This became a real chore, not only for the persons who have dementias, but also for the people who are caring them. And so we really have to realize that the impact of the protocols was a serious problem. The physical distancing, the masking up, the frequent hand washing, staying at home, and the lockdowns. Terrible, terrible things happened to our elderly and our dementia. So we had no visitors. Caregivers started being dressed up in all kinds of funny outfits. They had the PPEs, the protective gear. And even now I walk on the street and people might shout me and say hi, and I don't know who I'm speaking to, because that mask makes that face look very different. So what of the person in an institution having a little bit of a problem with memory, and suddenly you don't know what is going on because everybody's face looks essentially the same. So you have that as another problem. Then we had a situation where the staff was changing on us, because some people opted out after a while not to continue to work, because some of the caregivers are actually elderly people. Some of the caregivers had families at home that they had to now consider. Some of the caregivers were just afraid. And a situation where we're having new people going into situations, and our persons, the elderly, who depended on familiar faces, and people who they associated with being good to them and caring them suddenly not being around. So that brought on loads. Staff coming into work also, of course, the other big problem was people bringing the illness into the institution, not because they wanted to, but because they themselves had to be exposed. Many of them travel on public transport. Many of them had people who were working in other situations coming in and out of their homes. This situation was a disaster for nursing home care and for the vulnerable elderly. So the resulting problems, of course, would cause Alzheimer's disease, other dementias, and even people who were not in a situation of a dementia to have problems. And the issues were confusion, the unfamiliarity of persons looking after them because of the masks and protective gear bringing on that confusion. And what if you got ill and you got COVID? You suddenly had to go into quarantine. You had to go into isolation. You had to be relocated. I mean, these things for the ordinary person are devastating. And therefore, for the person with dementia, much more so. So we had further confusion because of the persons becoming infected. And you had loneliness. You had all kinds of situations arising because of, as I said, the protocols. They couldn't go to their doctors because they couldn't leave the home. Medications were sometimes a difficulty. Then you had the well elderly living in nursing homes. These people would sometimes take walks by themselves. Sometimes they'll be able to go to church with relatives. Sometimes they'll be able to go shopping with a nurse or with family. All of this came to an abrupt halt. I can't imagine what some of these people have gone through and are still going through and will continue to go through till we get rid of this pandemic. So I think one of the things that we have to realize is that the elderly have suffered. These changes are being prolonged and we don't know when they're going to stop, but we have to be supportive. And as often as people can visit, as often as people can get a chance, I know some of the nursing homes actually allow people to see their relatives at Christmas. This was really something that was very, very welcome because the elderly have been suffering. Now, I don't know if I should go on or if I should stop here, but I have to talk about the impact on those who are managed at home as well.
Yes, so before you go there, yeah, we're going to speak about that. I just wanted to hear from Pastor Jewel. I mean, Dr. Belwood has spoken about adherence to protocols and so on. Did you find that, or did your family find that as a challenge with your mom?
Yes, Lisa, we certainly did, because my mom still to this day does not understand why she has to wear a mask, for instance. So she wants to come out to church because she still loves church, still has that connection. But to sit for 2 hours with that mask is still very much a challenge for her. And that's just the mask alone. And the other protocols also are quite difficult. However, with her, when I sat her down and explained why it needed to be done, she tries sometimes to adhere to that, but it has been very difficult. And again, with even having people come over, like Dr. Bell spoke about, to visit, she is very social, so she likes for people to pop in and say hello. But for people especially during those lockdown times when she was just seeing maybe 3 or 4 people and not seeing her children and grandchildren, that was very traumatic for her. And Dr. Bell alluded to as well in terms of quarantine and isolation. And my mom did have COVID-19 and we had to go to isolation. I had to go with her. And I found that that was such a disruptive event for her because she could not understand why she had to leave her home and why she was in this strange place. So for the 10 days we were in isolation, I think, again, was so very tough for her because it was not a familiar place and she felt like we had moved her out of her home and we had put her someplace that she did not want to be. And that was a very tough situation because she didn't sleep, didn't want to eat well, was very, very restless for the entire period of time. And at sometimes became very aggressive because she wanted to be in a familiar place. So I concur with all that Dr. Bell has said, having experienced it, that this has been a particularly challenging time for someone who is experiencing dementia.
Dr. Bell, is what Reverend Jewel described, is that typical for persons who have been in isolation, who've been tested positive? How do you even get them to go to get a test done?
Well, that is easier in a way for the person with dementia than somebody who doesn't have it, because the person with dementia, you take them or you drive them in the car and somebody comes and does the test. And so they're not given a lot of discussion time in the situation of making decisions. The well elderly, it's a little bit more difficult for them because they're afraid sometimes of this thing being pushed in their noses. They're afraid of the new environment. They're afraid to be left with people who they don't know, and those fears are strong and real. And so you have different outcomes for different types of people, but it can bring on different stress factors in every single one of them, both the people with the dementias and the persons who are well elderly. You go ahead.
No, continue your point. Go ahead.
No, I was saying that Jewel very well led us into the whole concept of the impact on those managed at home, because her experience with somebody who was at home and not in a nursing home setting. And you can hear that the change was a big issue. Things had to change, and the change brought on confusion. The change brought on resistance. It brought on the whole concept of loss and loneliness, because you were now separated from relatives who would usually come and visit regularly, people who didn't necessarily live in the household but would be around at times, like grandchildren, for instance, as she mentioned. And so the whole environment became a lot more stressful for a lot of elderly persons, and the ones with dementia became extremely confused. And I did see evidence of that in my practice. The whole thing of confinement, even though you may have dementia, many nurses and persons who care for persons with dementia, the primary and the secondary caregivers, would spend time to take people out for a walk. And there was a routine that you would establish. So every evening you might walk around the garden, or you might just walk up your avenue and back. And there are things like this that people got accustomed to, and the routine was very important. All of this had to stop. So the confinement was very, very disturbing for many persons, and you'll find people trying to get out of the house, trying to get through the door, trying to leave, because they're confused about why these situations had changed. And there's also a situation of feeling neglected, because when you are at home, either with relatives or with caregivers, and they're dedicating time to you, that is all very well and good. But suddenly with COVID, you know what really changed? Sometimes there were just too many people in the house all day. There were children, there were grandchildren, there were other elderly people. It was just totally chaotic in some situations. And you can imagine a small household in a not very rich or well-positioned family, and everybody in this situation trying to function, falling over each other all day long while the lockdown was on. And very often the elderly were the ones who were left in their rooms, and they're the ones who started to feel neglect. They're the ones who started to feel the confinement. People who were in the household now, who are normally not there all the time, the ones who are mainly the primary caregivers, who used to go to work and were now in the household, very often became very irritable. And we had increased complaints from people who were caregivers because they were now frustrated, not just with the elderly. It wasn't the elderly that were frustrating them, that was frustrating them. It was the situation of not knowing when the job was going to reopen, not knowing where the money was coming from, not being sure how they were going to continue to buy these expensive Pampers and all the other things that are very costly, and having to look after these persons at home and the caregivers could no longer come in. That was the other situation that was a crisis. That the caregivers that normally would have taken up some of the slack were not able to come to the household. And if it were not for vaccination, that would have gotten even worse because persons would definitely not have been able to come back into work for fear of spreading the illness to the elderly. So we do have one blessing in that situation, that we were able to let people continue to work because they were vaccinated and were able to then be a little less of a threat to the elderly. So I think that is basically those persons who were living at home, who were suffering with dementia. But then we have another set of elderly again, and those are the elderly who live by themselves. Now just stop and think. You live by yourself. You're accustomed going down the road to the nearest little shop and buying A, B, and C. You were not allowed to do this anymore. You were having to cope with lockdowns. You couldn't understand. You couldn't keep up with the information and the rate at which it was coming in. You're elderly, so you're prone to forget things. So you might attempt to step out, and then the next thing you're met by with somebody saying, "Get back in your house, old lady." This was not pleasant. Then the coping with the long lines at the situations where you had curfews and partial lockdowns. The elderly suffered in those situations. They began to become afraid because they kept hearing, if you have non-communicative diseases, if you're elderly, you're going to more easily become ill. So they just got afraid of going out. Now, what happens when you get afraid of going out? You stop buying things that you need to help you to stay healthy. You stop going for your medication at the pharmacy, even though you were told that that was something that you could do. You didn't go to the clinic for your follow-up checkups. So you were neglecting yourself, and other people were not allowed to come in to be caring for you at that particular time. The elderly love church. They couldn't go to church. And a lot of them could not get the Zoom organized. And this is one of the things that was really a very, very serious problem, because they didn't know what to do when they couldn't get to their church services and they couldn't get to join with other people to commune. So they also are people, lots of elderly people. I don't know if you have noted that in the mornings early, elderly people go to the beach. I see them crossing Bay Street to go to the beach, and they cross back and go to their homes. They couldn't do this anymore because they were not supposed to be out during those hours. So they were, kind of forbidden to do the things that give them a little bit of pleasure and exercise. So then the joints start to seize up, they start to have other problems. So these difficulties were not only with those who have Alzheimer's and dementia and who were in institutions, but it's also the ones who were being cared for at home and the well elderly who lived alone. All of them suffered. I could stop there again, or I could continue.
I'm just going to take a pause. I want to ask you, as we talk about well elderly, I think it's great that you've made a distinction between the well as those who are vulnerable, those who are ill. Everybody suffered. One area I want to ask you about concerning the well elderly, and talk about technology. Many of them were accustomed to saying, going and changing their pension checks and going to the bank, to the counter and depositing and so on. But now I know like some banks have instituted policies where you can't come in unless you're withdrawing a certain amount. And guess is to keep the number of people who are coming into banks at a minimum. Now, this has also impacted on the elderly as well too, because I think, for example, like my mom, who will be in the category of well elderly, who may not be familiar with using the ATM. So whereas you may have some elderly people that may have people who they can trust to take them to banks and do their transactions, those persons who didn't, does that put them in a more vulnerable position, because you are now got to give some person your bank number, perhaps your PIN number, and as I said, you become a little more vulnerable. Is this also a way in which COVID-19, not the disease itself, but may have impacted some of those well elderly that you would have spoken about? Does it make them a bit more vulnerable to maybe fraud, to elder abuse in a different sense? And what are your thoughts on this? And this is open to any one of my guests here this evening.
Well, I could start because I have a little thing jotted down here about it, because in actual fact, it is very much a discussion point and it is discussed under the title of the digital divide, because it is really a major negative that has come out of COVID-19. It is a situation where, as you've said, the elderly across the world are not yet totally in line with technology. So when it comes to, as you suggest, as you mentioned, the ATMs and doing their banking, and even going into some places now that say you can't bring cash, you know, these things are really very hard on the elderly. And so it has been a situation where many of them have become very, very anxious and nervous and depressed over the fact that they have to learn all of these new things and undergo all these changes at a time in their life when they would really like to be relaxed. And so this digital divide, as it is referred to, has brought on confusion and dejection and anxieties, and has led to some people getting major psychiatric fallout, major depression, and situations even more distressing than just depression. But that is really one of the major outcomes, major negative outcomes of COVID-19 pandemic. But I like to, at the other end of the spectrum, then say that there are positive ones. And the one in relation to that, on the other side of the divide, is that now the elderly were forced to learn some of these things. So there are elderly people who have bought in to using technology. There are elderly people who are as adept as going on Zoom and on all of the other platforms to be in touch with their families, and the FaceTime and Instagram and all these other techniques they're using. And they're very adept at it because they were forced into having to learn. And of course, this will be more the well elderly, not the persons with dementia and Alzheimer's. So hopefully with all these things that have happened, that we, you know, can expand the good aspects of COVID-19 and hopefully get everybody on a page where they can deal with the digital world and get to a place where they can function normally and not get worried and upset over these problems.
Following on from that, does it, when I think of persons like Pastor Joel's mom, who would be extremely independent, and then you come into this situation now where you are kind of dependent on others to do certain things for you, does that put them in a more vulnerable position, do you think? Or it could or it could not? Yeah, I mean, as I said, my question is open to anyone, who's any of the ladies who are here. Yes. What are your thoughts?
Can I back up a bit here? Because I was listening to Dr. Bell talking about the elderly there at the bank and so on. And I have to say, I have experienced many times at the bank where persons were having difficulty accessing funds. And a number of times I've had persons come to me and say, would you help? Now, that is not an easy thing to do. And there are times when I would have to say no. Let's get some help from inside the bank, because it's not something you want to do, because you don't want to be accused of taking the funds, and you know, that's a difficult thing. And it's also the fact that the elderly that is left behind, nobody's visiting, they can't see their grandchildren or anything like that anymore. Again, Dr. Bell, you would know that leads to depression, and depression leads to dementia. You know, so there's so many different little areas in this to look at that it's almost like you can't win. But to get back to your question, which I totally forgot, maybe it's my Alzheimer's coming on. I forgot the question. What was it?
Well, I was asking, like, those persons who would have been considered in the well elderly, and then as a result of social isolation, they would have developed dementia. For example, Pastor Joel's mom. Does the whole banking and having now to depend on others, does that make them more vulnerable, do you think? And I use the example of the banking, and as you said, you know, having to depend on someone to withdraw money, to buy your groceries, to do different things like that for you. Does that put them in a more vulnerable position?
I would think so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's one word that the elderly don't like. They don't like the word dependent.
Yes.
They don't like to think that they are forced to lean on somebody And, it's like, then it's a waste of time living. So that's where the depression sometimes sets in. So I'm sure that, Joel, you can speak to that too.
Yes, I definitely can. One of the things that bothers my mom very much is that she can't do a lot of things anymore. And she talks about it quite often, for instance, especially going to the supermarket and doing those types of things. But even to the question that Lisa asked pertaining to being vulnerable, I have seen that played out because initially we still give our mom independence, where she still is in charge of doing her household chores and stuff like that. But in terms of changing, like for instance, her pension check, initially she did not want us to manage that. So she felt she could still manage it herself. And I remember that she was using her salesman to have her checks changed. But then it was a situation where you did not know what transactions took place there. And sometimes she wouldn't know what change she got back or how the check would have been changed and that type of situation. And it was quite difficult actually to persuade her to give over that responsibility to me. I think actually what did it is that one time she got the checks and she couldn't find them for a long, long time. And after that, she handed over, but after she handed over the responsibility, she still wanted it back because she felt that that gave her some measure of independence. And also in terms of that, there are occasions when my mom would ask somebody to come into the house to do something for her. And because of the dementia, she would just ask any stranger she saw passing the street, for instance, if they would come in, because we don't allow her to have like matches and so on. So she would, if she wants to do something and she feels no one is around to see her, she would ask a perfect stranger to come into the home to say, turn on her gas for her or light her stove for her and those types of things. And even though we've spoken to her about, how dangerous that might be, in her mind, she just wants this chore done. So definitely these things do put the elderly in a position of vulnerability in terms of having to depend on other people for things that they would normally do. And then like during the lockdown period, there are certain things that she wanted that perhaps if I shopped at the supermarket, she couldn't get. And normally she would just go to this shop that is nearby, but she would have to depend on somebody and put her money in their hands to say, look, could you get this item for me and whatnot? So this is where the vulnerability certainly comes into play in terms of the elderly, if they have dementia, and even in terms of the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Thank you so much.
Lisa, I was wondering, I think I see a hand up. So I was wondering if Myrna had something that she wanted to add in. One of the participants?
I'm not able to.
Our members. Remember
one of your members.
Mine, but I took,
okay. Oh, okay, great. So, Dr. Bell, I wanted to ask you, we started to talk about it a bit, about the impact on the caregiver. How does caring, especially in a COVID-19 environment, impact on the caregivers in terms of their mental health? Or maybe, Joel, you can come in first, and then maybe we can then hear from Dr. Bell, talk about how did you see it from your perspective? How did this impact either you or members of your family emotionally? How did it impact you?
Lisa, it was quite difficult for the entire family because we are all close to our mom and the grandchildren as well. So the first thing actually in terms of the dementia is seeing the deterioration and knowing that this is not the person that we're accustomed to. So that was emotionally very taxing on us. And then her diagnosis came during the pandemic. So that lent again a certain measure of stress to it, because here you are trying to now get accustomed to a new situation with mom, but because of the pandemic, you are limited in what care you can give her. You're limited in terms of what interactions you can have with her. Because again, I'm not living in the home. In the home are two men living with her, and their understanding of dementia and so on is limited. So for instance, my nephew was like 18 at the time, and initially he could not cope with it. And it took a lot of talking through and saying, look, remember, it is the condition, and this is not the person that is doing these things. And us going online and finding information and trying to be able to cope with it. But it was indeed quite difficult, and still is, because as the condition progresses, and again, we are still in the pandemic season, that lends a lot of stress to dealing with mom, and everybody is working or doing something, and how do we get care for her? And I can tell you, for me personally, there was a great concern in terms of her care. And as Ms. Brayton would have alluded to earlier, or spoke about earlier, how do we care for her, especially after the lockdown and everybody is anxious to get back out to work because you do have bills piling up, you have things to take care of, and who is going to look after mom, and who is going to be there to care for her, and how do we get someone to come in? Because mom is the type of person, she's sociable, she likes people, but she doesn't like them to be there for an extended period. So how do we now convince her that someone is to stay with her for an entire day or part of a day and so on? And we are still fighting that battle in trying to convince her that it is okay for a caregiver to come into her home and to be with her and to help her for the day. So it is something that you need really to sort through. And I think it's Ms. Brayton that spoke about, having people there, a support system in place to be able to help you through, especially in the initial stages. And definitely with a pandemic season, it has been extremely difficult to cope with someone who is elderly and dealing with dementia.
Actually, if I may say, it has become worse since the COVID, because the calls I get every day are people who are still struggling with mom and dad. They couldn't wash their hands and they don't know what to do. So you have to get creative and how to get this person to wash their hands, whether it's telling them or whether it's going out and buying something with their favorite smell or scent or whatever, just to get their minds, or realize, hey, you like this soap, you like this gel, it smells nice, it's lavender. Lavender might be their favorite scent, and those are the little things you have to get creative with in order to get them to do the things that are so important. So yes. The struggle is hard. It really is. I have a book sits beside me here, and if you see the names and all the people that call me every day, the same situation. If it's not the bank, it's not eating. If it's not eating, it's not getting them to bathe. It's a variety of different things that they go through. And yes. There's no one answer or no answer to fit. Again, it goes back to creativity and finding someone sometimes to be at home with the person. It should be somebody that they feel comfortable with. It has to be somebody that they trust. If you can find someone in the family members or even a friend from the church, someone that they like, to be able to sit with them at least a couple of hours a day, it's also good to change that person if you can to make things different.
Okay. Well, our challenge was a little different in that, mom has this compulsive thing where she likes to bathe, and we have had to become very creative in. She still likes to carry out her chores and do what she wants to do. So in terms of like cooking, she wants to cook all day long, and she wants to take a bath all day long. So that was one of the stressors on our family on how do we now find ways that we can help her not to see that she doesn't need to do these things. And that's, again, still an ongoing situation where we've had to try to be creative and figure out how do we curtail these activities and allow her still to have her independence at the same time. So that in itself has been a challenge in it, because if you try to stop her to do some of these things, then this is where she can become aggressive. So is how do we curtail the activities and still have her to be contented or happy or whatever?
Well, I would think that if she still likes to cook, you can't stop that as long as you supervise the cooking, you know, or what you just said too, is she likes to take a bath all the time. It goes the opposite way for a number of people who hate bathing, period. So you're lucky in a sense. It's just a question that she would need more supervision doing the things that she's doing. And you're lucky to be able to say, well, come home and get a nice meal, you know, so don't knock it. It's just like I often tell the story with the lady who told me her mother likes to wash, and she would wash something every day and put it on the line, and she would get up, pick it up, wash it again, put it back on the line, but yet the laundry is piling up. So all I'm saying is, why not give her at least 5 pieces a day to wash, and eliminate some of your stress coming home to worry about the laundry for the weekend. So, you know, they can still do things, but they have to be supervised. That's the key, to be supervised.
Your thoughts, Dr. Bell, any thoughts?
Well, I concur with what the others have been saying, really. It's a challenge, a serious challenge in the situation of monitoring behaviors and trying to keep people on track and trying to keep them focused and helping them still to live a normal life. It is really, really, really hard. And so I think they have pretty much put on the table, you know, what I would want to say as far as that is concerned.
It's not an easy task, really, it's not. Again, you have to know the person that you're caring for, what they were like before, the things they like to do, and then you work from there.
That's true.